This is True Crime Out Loud.
I'm your host, B.
And I'm your host, Jen.
And this week's case comes to us by listener recommendation from Shelley in Texas. This week we'll be going to Tenino, Washington. Located in Thurston County, Washington, Tenino is a small community, 1.44 square miles, with a population of about 1,700 people. And this week's case focuses on 36-year-old Nancy Moyer, who grew up in Olympia, Washington. She was very popular in high school, got along with everybody, and was loved by everyone. She attended college at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, Washington, where she studied accounting. During her time in college, she began working as a temp at an agricultural office. During the course of her work, she met her husband, Bill Moyer. After she graduated from college, they got married. And a little over a year later, she found out she was having a baby, and they did, in fact, have two children, Samantha and Amanda. Nancy worked at the Department of Ecology and had been there for a little over 10 years and was a fiscal analyst. Her and Bill ran into some troubles, and they separated in 2007 after 11 years of marriage, but remained on good terms. Everyone, in fact, said that it was completely amicable. They didn't even bother getting a divorce. They just kind of separated and began living their separate lives. They also shared custody of the girls and didn't have an issue with that. Nancy had the girls during the week, and Bill had them on the weekends. Nancy was described as an attentive mother, and Bill was described as a hands-on father.
Our case begins on March 8th of 2009, which was a Sunday. Bill had the kids for the weekend, so on Sunday he drove the girls to Nancy's house to drop them off. But he couldn't find Nancy. Her front door was partially open and the lights were on, so he and the kids went on inside thinking, well, maybe she went for a walk and didn't get the door shut. They wait and they wait, but after a while she still didn't return. And Bill knew that this was very out of character for Nancy because neither of them had missed a drop-off or a pickup in the 2 years that they had been doing this. He tried calling her phone, but the phone rang inside the home, so she didn't have her phone with her. There were no signs of forced entry, and to Bill's knowledge, nothing was out of place. So he thought, okay, maybe she has something going on and didn't tell me, so he took the daughters back to his home. Well, the next morning, he still had not heard from Nancy, and she didn't show up for work, so he called and reported her missing. The police respond, and they go to Nancy's home. Inside, they find 2 glasses on the coffee table. One contained red wine, and the other was empty. Her purse and keys were inside the home, also her cell phone, like we said earlier, along with her driver's license, checkbook, credit cards, everything still in her purse. Nancy's car was sitting in the driveway, so they knew she hadn't driven off on her own. They take fingerprints, and all they really find is on the glasses and the coffee table, but they were Nancy's fingerprints. They did discover that one item was missing, and this was a long brown coat, and it had a fur-type lining, and she wore this often, so people knew that it should be in the home, but it was missing. They also search her car. They find nothing, no signs of foul play. So they backtrack. They want to know what are the last steps of Nancy Moyer. They go back to the Friday before she was reported missing on Monday, and that was Friday, March 6th of 2009. Nancy had carpooled home with a coworker, Matthew, as she usually did. She dropped him home around 4:45 to 5:30. She told him that she was going to spend the weekend at home and relax. At 6:45 p.m., they know she went to a local store for wine and food. No one at the store saw anybody with Nancy or anybody following her or anybody suspicious. But they wanted to look at the surveillance footage, but there wasn't any. Around 9 or 9:30 p.m. on Friday night, she was actually seen by a local police officer who happened to be running radar in the area of her home. He said he saw her in the driveway. She was alone and seemed to be unloading groceries. They also discover a little after midnight, a neighbor heard something strange. She heard a hurried female voice and a slamming car door. But she just assumed that this was Nancy and the girls. The next known thing between midnight on Friday night was when Bill went to the home Sunday afternoon and found the door partially ajar. So the police do something a little bit further. They also check utility records, and what they see is that the electricity in her home spiked between 9 p.m. Friday night and midnight. So from this, they gather that this is possibly when the door was left ajar, and it caused the heat to kick on and stay on and caused a spike in the power. Now remember, she was last seen by that police officer between 9 and 9:30. The spike is between 9 and midnight, and it was midnight when the neighbor heard a hurried female voice in the car door. They look into Nancy's financials. They discovered that she was deeply in debt to the tune of about $50,000. But the big thing is they discovered there were no charges after the Friday that she was last seen. The answer machine in the home had several messages, and they were from a man named Jim. He was wanting to meet up with Nancy on Saturday night for a date. They did not know who Jim could be, nor did anyone else.
So the police have a mystery on their hands. Nancy is missing, but there's no signs of foul play. So they've looked at her financials, they checked the power bill, and there's definitely some strange goings on surrounding her disappearance. But they really want to dive into who she was as a person to kind of give them some insight into where she might be. It was reported by several of her friends that after the separation, she made some lifestyle changes, I guess you'd say. She had 1 or 2 tattoos before, but then had started to obtain several others. She also began going out to local bars and forming new social relationships, and most of her previous relationships have been with coworkers, people in her office, so she started to branch out a little bit. Nancy was known to be very private about her life, so her old friends and coworkers never really mingled with these new friends at the bar. They were kind of separated from each other. She had started dating again and had dated men at work and men that were outside of her work. The police discovered that although it was possible she was having sexual encounters, being very private, everyone agreed that she would not bring a man back to her home. She shared some information with her sister regarding her life, but not all of it. Nancy's behavior is pretty typical of someone recently divorced, and that doesn't give the police anything to go on. So they start looking at motives and theories, and obviously one of the first things you're going to look at is that she voluntarily walked away from her life. They also thought that she possibly took a walk on one of the trails near her home, which was a forested area with expansive wilderness where she may have become injured. Then, as they always do with a missing person case, even though they didn't have any signs of foul play, they're always going to look towards the ex-spouse or the current spouse. And in this case, the police were concerned that Bill may have had a reason due to marital strife. They're also interested in this coworker, Matthew, who she was obviously friends with and frequently carpooled with. They thought that her disappearance may revolve around a sexual encounter gone bad, possibly from a new friend in her new circle of friends that her old friends weren't aware of. So the police develop these theories and motives, but they're just that. And there's really not a whole lot of information to back up one or the other. So they have to start diving into it. And they start with Bill. He's there. He's the easiest thing to rule in or rule out. And they have no issues from Bill. He's cooperative with police. He voluntarily took a polygraph and passed. Matthew, the co-worker that we told you about that she often carpooled with, stated that they were just friends and he had been home all weekend with his wife and young children. Co-workers backed this up and said they were just friends, and Nancy was even friends with Matthew's wife. The police talked to Nancy's sister about Jim, the person who left the messages on the phone. She didn't know about anyone named Jim, but she stated to police that she did know someone named William. The police locate William and they begin looking into him. And although he was a registered sex offender, he was quickly ruled out because he had a verified alibi and he wasn't involved. The police talk to co-workers and other people at work, and everyone's trying to help. But one seemed to kind of bounce back and forth from cooperative and not so cooperative, and his name was Jim Roth. Police discover that this was, in fact, the Jim on the answering machine. Jim said that he had been on a few dates with Nancy, and the last was a few weeks ago where she stayed the night at his home and left the next morning. He stated to police that they tried to have intercourse, but he was unable. Now, Jim is separated from his wife and was at his apartment with his two sons. Police talked to his estranged wife, and they also wanted to talk to the sons to kind of verify Jim's story. And Jim's estranged wife says that the boys told her that Daddy did not leave all night, but his estranged wife refused to let police speak directly to the young boys. About 2 weeks after Nancy's disappearance, Roth tells police that he went by Nancy's house on Saturday night and he saw the door ajar. He called for Nancy and had no answer, so he stepped inside and called her again, but again had no answer. He told police that he went into her bedroom and did not see her there. He went by there, according to him, because she had not returned his calls after he left those messages on the answering machine that the police had already heard. Roth stated to police that that was only the second time he had ever been to her house, the first time being when he went there to pick her up for a date. Now, something about Jim's story kind of raises police suspicion. Sometimes when people are trying to provide a reason, they may put themselves at a place in a seemingly innocent manner, like, oh, I went by her house to check on her because she hadn't answered my calls. And the police speculate that this may be an attempt for Jim to establish some credibility if his DNA is found inside her home or inside her bedroom. Like, he might have made that up so that when police later find his DNA in there, there's a reason. But none of Roth's DNA or fingerprints were found at her home. They didn't have enough to get a search warrant for his vehicle or his home. Roth also submitted to a polygraph that came back inconclusive. And True Crime Out Loud listeners know how I feel about polygraphs. Does that mean he's involved? Well, maybe, but maybe not. And like I always say, there's a reason those things aren't admissible in court.
So I'm going to move forward to August 8th of 2010. This is a year and a half after Nancy went missing. Something pretty significant happens. In the small town of Tenino, police pull over a meat delivery truck. And it's one of those meat trucks, they put a cooler on the back of a pickup and they go door to door selling meat. They pull him over, and in the passenger seat was a sleeping bag with a dead body inside. And this was the body of 60-year-old Vonda Boone. The driver was Bernard Howell. He went by Keith, and he was about 26 years old. And the significance of this is because it happened in this same very small town where Nancy Moyer had gone missing. They discovered that Howell had been using methamphetamines and was angry that day because of his failing business ventures he was getting into. So he went on a hiking trail, and this trail was less than a mile from Nancy's house. And this is where Vonda ran into her killer. Howell had slit her throat, beat her about her head and face, suffocated her, and said that he had sex with her deceased body. But he says he found her deceased, and he denied killing her. He said he was going to bury her body to save her family money. How this came about was Howell had asked a stranger at the store to help him move Vonda's body. Obviously, he's on meth and not thinking clearly, so he asked the stranger, "Will you help me move a dead body?" And this man flagged down a police officer, and he in turn pulled him over. Well, Howell's home, where he lived with his father, was less than a mile from Nancy's home. They go back to what they found in Nancy's home when she originally went missing a year and a half before. There was meat found in her freezer, and it was the same brand that Howell was selling door to door. They showed her daughters a lineup with Howell included in it, and they ID him as the person who had sold meat to their mother. Now, he claimed before and even after the daughters ID'd him that he had not been to her home and he was not the one that sold her meat. In 2011, so a year later, Howell entered a guilty plea on Vonda's case. Police tried to question him again on Nancy's case, but they said he refused to cooperate in any way other than saying he did not know her, he never had contact with her, and he had not sold her meat. He refused to give them a detailed statement of any kind, and he refused to polygraph. Prior to this murder of Vonda Boone, Howell had no criminal history.
So after Vonda's case, Nancy's case goes cold again until about 2012, which is about 3 years after Nancy went missing. Detective Ben Elkins begins re-interviewing people, and he's just looking for missed clues or anything that might open the case up. He also doesn't believe Jim Roth's story. He says that it just doesn't add up. You know, he was a co-worker and they only went on one date. Remember, the police had looked at him early in the investigation. So time passes and he continues to investigate. And 4 years after Nancy went missing in 2013, he interviews Jim Roth again. And this time, Jim's story changes a little. Now, if you'll remember, he originally told detectives that they tried to have sex, but he was unable. In this interview, he tells Detective Elkins that they did have sex. Now, Nancy had, like we said, had several tattoos, and some of them were in places that would be seen in an intimate setting, but he didn't recall seeing any of those tattoos. Police begin to think he could have possibly imagined a relationship that basically never happened. Another inconsistency is he originally said that he went there on Saturday night after she didn't answer his messages that he left on her answering machine. And remember, he says that he walked into her bedroom. Well, now he tells Detective Elkins that that actually happened on Friday night. Well, these are inconsistencies, but they're not really anything to hold him on. And in 2017, Jim Roth dies of natural causes. So the trail pointing to him kind of ends there. In May of 2019, so much time has elapsed with no sightings of Nancy or anything like that, that the case is officially reclassified from a missing persons case to a no-body homicide. Police do this because it allows them to have greater resources. They can call in extra help and get more other agencies involved if it's classified as a homicide.
Well, I'm going to stay in the same year in 2019. On July 9th of 2019, now we're over 10 years after Nancy went missing, the police get a 911 call. The caller is 53-year-old Eric Roberts. He tells them that he killed Nancy Moyer and he wanted to confess. Roberts had been a neighbor of Nancy and also a co-worker. Police get statements from Roberts. He said that he killed Nancy by strangling her with a scarf during rough sex at his house. He said he burned the scarf because it disgusted him. And then he says, well, she attacked him and he just reacted. He said he was just tired of holding all this inside, and she was gone, and he didn't think anybody would be able to find her. He said he didn't want to incriminate himself any further, but if he were to dispose of a body, it would be in the fire pit in his backyard. And he alluded to her clothing still being in his basement. Now, like I said, he was a former neighbor, so he was only a few houses down. He worked with Nancy, and she had also dated his nephew, Aaron Huntley. The police had interviewed Roberts right after Nancy went missing, but there was nothing significant from that interview. So the police began their search of his property the next day, July 10th, to see what they can find. I mean, we finally solved the case. We got a confession, right? Well, the day they began their search, he recanted his confession. But in the search, they found firearms, and 2 of those were in violation of state law. So he was arrested on the firearms charges, and it was unlawful possession of dangerous weapons and unlawful possession of a short rifle. The day after that, he was charged federally also for weapons violations, but those charges were dismissed. 10 days after he confessed, on July 19th, Roberts was arrested for 4th-degree assault domestic violence, and the victim was his adult son. Shortly after that, on July 31st, those charges were dropped because his son did not want to prosecute. Roberts later does an interview with Hide and Seek podcast, and he tells them that he didn't even remember his confession to the police. He thinks the prescription drugs he was taking is what made him call police and confess, but it wasn't the truth. Robert said he'd never had sex with Nancy, and she had never been on his property that he knew of, and detectives were even making parts of the story up. He said he never said anything about a scarf. Now remember, he said he doesn't remember the confession. So then how does he remember that he didn't say anything about a scarf? He said when he talked about getting rid of a body in the fire pit, he was referring to himself because he wants to be cremated in his fire pit. He said his reason for calling 911 is because he thought he saw somebody on his property. So he called 911 and confessed to killing Nancy Moyer to get the police there. So basically what you can infer from this is he is making erratic statements and probably has something else going on within him. They did recover evidence from his property and it was sent for testing, but nothing to relate him back to Nancy Moyer. The police had arrested him and held him on probable cause, and they had justification to do that. But to take him to trial, as we all know, the prosecution's going to need more than probable cause. They're going to need proof beyond a reasonable doubt to get a jury to convict him. They are going to need evidence that's independent of this confession, which can link him back to the crime of murder of Nancy. But they don't have it. So he is released on that charge, and he still remains a person of interest to this day.
So Nancy Moyer's case has never had a conclusion to this point. We don't know. And again, just kind of recapping some of the odd circumstances surrounding the case, there was no signs of anything disturbed in the home except the door being ajar. Nothing really missing except for the fur coat. I mean, nothing really seemed out of place.
They do have the neighbor heard a hurried woman's voice about midnight and a car door slam. I mean, I think that and the open front door are the only signs of anything that they have.
Yeah, and that's really not, those are weak signs of anything. I mean, I don't know. You know me, I'm reluctant to adopt the old someone just disappeared in the woods routine. I think that is highly unlikely in today's time for sure. Even when this case took place in 2009, people just don't usually vanish without a trace and be gone for forever. Like we walk out in the woods and we fall and break our ankle and then we die there or whatever. That just doesn't happen very much. And I don't think that happened in this case.
You know me, I am one to think that people do have accidents and die in mysterious ways and they're just not found. So we differ there. And that was one theory, that she was walking on the trail and was injured and fell, and she just went out and didn't get her door closed good. The thing that leads away from that, though, is that spike in the power bill from 9 p.m. to midnight.
Well, if the door is open from that time,
That would mean that was when the door was open. So I don't think it's likely she's going to go hiking in the woods between 9 p.m. and midnight.
yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. That would definitely be an odd time, particularly a more dangerous time, I guess, to go hiking. And again, this hiking in the woods thing, especially in essentially your backyard. I mean, who disappears in their woods behind their house and they're never found? I realize that can happen. I just think that's unlikely.
And you're a little bit of a salty bee, but that's okay. I don't think that happened in this case. I'm not of that opinion, but it is one theory they had to look at.
Oh, sure. And I just think that a good ground search of the area behind there could tell you one way or another. I mean, if she did have some accident within walking distance of her home, but in this one, you say you don't think it happened that way anyway. So I guess there's no need to beat a dead horse. I just don't think that people disappear in the woods a whole lot. I obviously don't think Bill's involved in it because he's taken a polygraph and been cooperative with police and all that. I mean, they ruled him out pretty quick. The Jim Roth guy,
The coworker?
yeah, he's kind of strange. And his story did change, but to me, those aren't real significant changes. People, those dates, and, he gets questioned about it 3 years later after the disappearance, and his dates are off by one day. He says, maybe I went over there Friday night instead of Saturday. I don't know. That's not real conclusive. That's not real conclusive of any wrongdoing or anything. I mean, dates are one of the first things that it tends to slip with people.
Well, I would agree with that, but he says he waits 2 weeks to tell them that he went over there on that Saturday night. So let's say, he comes back and says Friday, but let's say it is the Saturday he goes over there. And he finds Nancy's not answering his phone calls. She's not in her house. The door is ajar. I mean, we're talking early March in Washington State. You don't think anything suspicious. You don't close the door because her door's left open. I mean, I just think it's his whole thing of going over there on Saturday night was suspicious. If he even really went over there, because it sounds like that they were thinking there might be some kind of maybe mental health going on with him.
Yeah, and he may have just made up. We see this sometimes where people do this weird stuff to kind of interject themselves into investigations, even though, boy, who wants to be a part of a police investigation, particularly a homicide, when they're not really involved? But we see that a lot. I mean, where people just make up their involvement and they want to give the police just enough that they'll get some attention from the police, but we don't want to look like we've actually done anything.
I don't know that he was doing it for that reason, because he was on the answer machine leaving messages. They were trying to find who he was. Then they find who he was, and he waits 2 weeks to tell them anything. And then also he goes over there on Saturday night, but supposedly he's at his apartment with his 2 young sons. The young sons say he never left. I mean, it's just, I don't know. It's too much. I mean, if he were still alive, I would say dig a little bit harder and see what's going on with Jim Roth. I'm sure they did at the time, but he's deceased, so there's no point in even debating his involvement.
Well, and let's face it, he's certainly acting suspicious and giving some conflicting stories and stuff, but he's nowhere in the ballpark that Eric Roberts is, who admits to it and then recants. So, I don't know, of these people, including Howell, the meat guy, I write him off pretty quick. He's a murderer, okay, and he could have been involved. But her having that meat in her freezer and the kids identifying him, I don't know. It's as
Well, and he only lived down the street, so you could assume that he would be hitting up his neighbors for buying meat. And he obviously didn't hide the body good. He asked for a stranger to help him move the body of Vonda Boone.
Sure, and I'm sure that his drug use had a lot to do with that. But, I mean, in this particular case, I think Roberts is your strongest suspect. But the kicker to this whole thing is that outside of Bill, who we've already said is already cleared, all of these guys are viable suspects. There's just no direct evidence linking any of them to it. And you would have to have some kind of direct evidence to get any kind of conviction.
Yeah, well, but Eric Roberts, again, the neighbor who confessed, obviously sounds like he has some mental health issues going on or something going on, because he confesses, he recants, and then he says he doesn't remember telling them, and then he kind of jumps here to there and says things that nobody would believe. I mean, not even a reasonable person. Nobody would believe, oh, well, I was talking about finding a body in a fire pit because I want to be cremated in my own fire pit in my backyard. So his statements are just kind of off the wall to where, I mean, you know, and like you said, people interject themselves into cases. But this case was very popular in the area. It's even been on the show Disappeared. I mean, they did an episode on Nancy Moyer. So it's a very popular case in the area and also in the U.S. So, I mean, he could have legitimately, I mean, we have seen people do weirder things. He could have legitimately seen somebody on his property and called and confessed to Nancy to get them over there.
Yeah, I mean, he could have. I don't know. I think, I still feel like he's probably the strongest one. Now, one thing that makes me kind of shy away from him is it is so long before he calls the police and confesses before recanting. I would be interested to know, and it may have been hard for the police to do. They may not have been able to do it at all since his statement came so far after her disappearance. But I would be interested to know if the police were able to establish his whereabouts during the time that she disappeared. So can they backtrack essentially almost well over 10 years and say, where were you on March 8th?
And I couldn't tell you where I was on March 8th of 2010. So people don't know, and those things you do lose over time. I would be very interested in reading through this case file. Not that I could solve it, but this is a very interesting case to me just because they know something has happened. They just don't know what, and they don't know where. And their suspect list, they have a list instead of one or two. They have several people that they've had that are persons of interest in this case.
Yeah, and I just think absent of any physical evidence directly linking one of these guys, Roth, Howell, or Roberts, it's unlikely that, and as we said, Roth's already passed away, so he wouldn't be prosecuted, but it's unlikely that we would ever get any closure to her case, absent some type of physical evidence linking these guys or someone else to it.
Yeah. I mean, it's terrible. And I know I get emails from listeners and I get texts from other people that know me. I don't like the cases that don't have an ending. Well, those are the cases that intrigue me the most. And B's kind of like, I like cases that have closure to them. But I think all stories are important to be told, and especially these without closure, because like we always say, you may have that little bit of tidbit of information that could push this over the line. Her daughters still advocate for their mom and help us find our mom. And, you know, they're grown now. They were little girls when their mom went missing, and now they're still looking for her. But anybody with information in this case can contact the Thurston County Sheriff's Office at 360-786-5530.
And like you said, we always put that out there in case somebody knows something. So if you do, give them a call. We hope you enjoyed this week's case. And as always, we'll see you next week. We would like to hear your thoughts on this and all of our cases. And as always, you can reach us by email at truecrimeoutloud@gmail.com, Facebook and Instagram at True Crime Out Loud. Out Loud is 2 words, not one, and Twitter at TC Out Loud.
Photos, links, and sources for this case can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.